everybody, it's Caitlin. Welcome back to CoronaChat. Tonight is Wednesday, June 10th, and we're going to talk a little bit about convalescent plasma, which is one of the experimental treatments that's currently being used for coronavirus patients. But what is it? So convalescent plasma is a treatment that is derived from the blood of people who have had a disease and recovered. Right? Plasma is a part of our blood. It's about 55% of our blood overall, and it contains antibodies, which are part of our immune system, right? The red blood cells that move the oxygen around our body, the platelets that help us clot if we get cuts, we don't bleed to death, right? Like all those other components of blood. When we talk about convalescent plasma, we're talking about separating the plasma and the antibodies from the other parts of the blood, and the treatment is just the plasma and these antibodies, right? And the idea behind this treatment is that antibodies from someone who effectively fought off a virus could help people who are struggling to recover. Now, antibodies help our immune systems recognize the virus and know to attack it. Right? Our bodies produce them naturally, but it can take a little while for us to have enough of them to actually do anything. First, our immune system has to learn what the virus looks like, and then develop a way to tell the virus apart from the other things in our bodies, like our own cells. And then produce enough antibodies that our system is awash in them so the virus can't hide. And while that process is ramping up, our body is losing valuable time in its fight against COVID. If we just give the immune system antibodies that already work instead of waiting for it to produce antibodies, the thinking goes, we might be able to give a sick person's immune system a boost in fighting back. Right? This kind of treatment has been used before with SARS, Ebola, H1N1, and it's actually been used since the late 1800s, dealing with things like diphtheria, and we even tried it against the 1918 flu. However, when it comes to coronavirus, convalescent plasma has not been thoroughly tested yet, so we don't actually know if it's a safe and effective treatment for COVID-19. Right? We have reason to think it might work, but we need to test it and make sure first. The Food and Drug Administration, which is the main agency responsible for regulating medicines here in the United States, still considers convalescent plasma an investigational treatment for COVID-19. And when treatment is labeled as investigational, patients will most often receive it as part of a clinical trial. Sometimes doctors with a severely ill patient who can't participate in or access a clinical trial for whatever reason can request what's called a single-use waiver, basically a special exception to make sure that this patient can get access to the experimental treatment. But this is pretty rare. So that said, there's a lot of different studies on convalescent plasma popping up all over the world, but most of them are coming from researchers in China. The most recent of these papers was published on June 3rd, like just last week. Now, there were some problems with this study, the biggest being that it actually had to stop recruiting people because Wuhan went into lockdown. And their study outcomes ended up not being statistically significant, so it's hard to draw too many conclusions right now. But experts are hopeful that this type of treatment could be used if it's been sufficiently tested and shown to be effective. And the other thing is that convalescent plasma could potentially be used, again, if effective, in combination with other types of drugs and treatments. There are lots of other clinical trials starting up and recruiting patients all over the world, so we should have more information about this experimental treatment in the future. But some of the remaining questions about convalescent plasma right now are around when it should be administered, right? Like some experts think that it should potentially be administered to people who are already infected, but before their own immune systems detect the virus, right? So maybe this is people who, because of contact tracing, testing and contact tracing, we know we're exposed to someone who's infected, but they haven't yet become sick, right? Other experts think that actually convalescent plasma might be best used as prevention for people who are at high risk of getting infected with COVID, as opposed to as a treatment. But again, we don't quite know for sure yet, so we need more research on this. And some of the other questions that scientists are still asking include things like how much plasma is needed to be effective, who would get the most benefit from getting a plasma transfusion, and how do we equitably distribute plasma donations, right? Because we know that since we can only get convalescent plasma from people who have already recovered, and that many people who are potentially exposed could need it, we know that demand for this is going to far outstrip supply. So how do we decide who gets access? Because we know very little about how the COVID-19 virus changes over time, we also don't yet know if recovered people's plasma would be useful in future waves of coronavirus, like the probable second wave that we keep hearing about, but we don't know if and when it'll come, right? So there's also a lot of work underway right now to decide what kind of infrastructure, both in terms of kind of regulatory infrastructure like laws, policies, and actual physical infrastructure like buildings, what kinds of machines are needed, right? We need to figure all of that out so that we can actually get convalescent plasma out to people who are sick if it turns out that it's an effective treatment. And for those who are interested, we'll drop a link to one of the papers in the show notes. And the scientists who wrote this paper also formed a group called the COVID-19 Convalescent Plasma Project to help speed up research on convalescent plasma. And their website is ccpp19.org. And it's got lots of really good information, like links to news articles, published papers, and lots of other information. So if you're interested, we will also put that link in the show notes so you can find it and track it down. In the meantime, if you've got any other questions about convalescent plasma, or of course anything else related to coronavirus, go ahead, drop them in the comments, send us a note. We'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, stay safe, take care of one another. We are all in this together, and we'll see you all back here tomorrow night on CoronaChat. Have a good night, everybody.